Welcome to this review of Game of Thrones, which will be talking a lot about the game of Risk and how I think it applies or can be used metaphorically to discuss the change that occurred in the show. Specifically, I believe, along with many other folks, that there was a distinct change in tone between the book seasons, which were approximately 1 through 5, and the post-book seasons, which were seasons 6 through 8. And I think that some of these changes can be explained by using a metaphor of the classic strategy game Risk. For those of you who are not familiar with the board game, Risk is a classic game that features 1 through 5 players, and it's basically a game based around the theme of world domination. It involves amassing armies and attacking and defending different territories, and it basically makes use of both a playing deck of cards as well as dice, which are used for primarily the attack and defensive mode. Risk, much like Monopoly, has probably several hundred novelty versions of it at this particular point in history, and one of these versions is themed based on Game of Thrones, which works out very well so that I'm able to use it easily for this review. Now, there's actually a couple different versions of Risk when it comes to Game of Thrones. I'm going to be focusing on the Skirmish Edition, which basically uses the classic Risk rules with a couple little additions to it. In addition to the change in, of course, the map from a real-world map to the map of Westeros, the Risk version of Game of Thrones also includes castles and ports, which modify some of the point rules as well as some of the movement rules. But overall, though, the skirmish method, the skirmish edition, is almost identical to the classic version of Risk. If you've never played Risk, well, then let me go over the rules very quickly so that you all understand where I'm coming from and will be able to follow along with this metaphor. The object of Risk is very simple. It's to conquer all territories. And the rules are also very simple and straightforward. You gain armies through gaining more territories, especially sets, which are generally color-coded. And in the version of Game of Thrones Risk, you also get points for castles and ports. You can gain extra armies through trading in card sets. You attack other players who are in territories adjacent to you and likewise defend from those players' attacks. And of course, finally, you can move armies through your adjacent territories. Now, whereas the classic game of Risk has only up to 5 players, we could think of Game of Thrones, the initial seasons, as actually having 8 players, representing the great houses that when the War of the Five Kings broke out. But nevertheless, the rules of the game were followed pretty strictly, and I think this metaphor can be applied very easily in a number of examples of how the show played out in these early seasons. Example number 1. One of the earliest moves in the War of the Five Kings, the War of Game of Thrones Risk, is Tywin Lannister attempting to take out Ned Stark. And you can think of it in terms of the game where Tywin is basically trying to anticipate Ned's movements and is a very good judge of characters because Ned is a very straightforward, honorable sort of person. So anyway, in the context of the game, Tywin assigns the Mountain Who Rides to lead some of his armies to attack a territory in the Riverlands to basically to terrorize it and to take it over. So because he does this because he anticipates Ned Stark always wanting to take things under his own control, that he will basically ride out then to recapture this territory, to deal with the mountain, and then of course he can counterattack and wipe out Ned Stark early on and therefore score an easy victory and take out one of his major threats. Something that Tywin did not anticipate, however, is his son Jaime Lannister attacking Ned Stark in the streets of King's Landing and injuring, well, okay, he didn't actually do it, one of his men did, but bottom line is that Ned Stark got injured in the leg. So this meant Ned Stark was unable to lead forces out personally to respond to the mountain and the attack in the Riverlands, and he had to assign the task to Sir Beric Dondarrion, who obviously later then became the one-eyed, avatar for the Lord of Light and all of that kind of stuff. So you see here, it's a move of basically, effect and counter effect with many different players, and it's very cause and effect. And the moves and some of the element of drama that comes into the show is really because not these characters making bad moves, but just events happening that they did not foresee. And as Cersei Lannister would say, the object of the game is you either win or you die. And this is why characters like Ned Stark were fairly bad at the game. You could arguably say that, early on, Ned Stark's like, we should all just forfeit. We should let Stannis win. And the Lannisters are like, that's not how you play this game, Ned, obviously. And this is arguably the reason why Ned is taken out pretty early in the game, because, he has a different sense of playing by the rules than the rest of them do. Or I should say he doesn't quite understand the rules the way characters like Tywin do. Example number 2. So after some of the initial moves, of course, now Robb Stark is again trying to take out Tywin Lannister, who he considers the major threat, thinking about it in context of the game. And he's moved his pieces out into the Westerlands and is attempting to anticipate how to trap his enemy and defeat him. Basically, he expects Tywin to attack his forces in the Westerlands, which will then allow him to counterattack and take over. Again, very point and counterpoint kind of methodology. What Robb Stark, of course, unfortunately fails to anticipate is another player in the game. In this case, his cousin Edmure Tully, who has control of his own forces. So Edmure, since he doesn't understand Robb's plan, he decides to get involved. And when Tywin starts to move his forces, Edmure thinks, hey, I can move and attack and we'll score this great victory. And not understanding that Robb wanted to draw Tywin out into the Westerlands and defeat him there. This has the result of course, since Tywin has to withdraw his forces to around Harrenhal, then when Stannis gets involved and decides that he wants to attack King's Landing, before he can do this, well, in conjunction with doing so, Tywin is able to reinforce his forces at King's Landing and repel the attack during the very famous Battle of Blackwater Bay. And of course, then, the House Tyrell under Loras, they're also able to ally with the Lannisters and wage a counterattack as well, if you want to get down into the weeds. But the bottom line is it's move and counter move. All of these characters, all of these factions, all of these different players are engaging in what could really be thought of as a game, hence the title, Game of Thrones. This is why, too, later on, Tywin very much understands that the object is to win or you die, and he's willing to do what it takes. And when he realizes that Robb is basically countering all of his moves effectively in the South, he has a good understanding of Robb's character. He has a good understanding of how Robb is going to react to the Iron Men attacking the North. And he also has a good understanding of how Walder Frey is going to react to his promises and how he feels slighted and everything, which of course gives us the Red Wedding and all of the fallout from there. Again, very much an issue where the characters who are winning aren't the good guys, and they're not winning because they're villainous necessarily, but they're winning because they understand the rules of the game and how to play it. But then the rules changed on us. So instead of just the game playing itself out and like the showrunners just kind of recording how it goes, there was almost like this when they ran out of source material from the books and there was a desire, well, we know what endpoint we want to end up with. To me, this felt very much like, HBO was inserting a referee into the game to be like, hey, I got to create some new rules because the game's not exactly going quick enough. And hey, we got to get to this endpoint and we know who's going to win. And so, hey, let's create a whole bunch of new crazy rules. And I'm sure the audience won't even notice. But we did. So let's go over these rules, shall we? Starting with rule number 1. Movement rules no longer apply. So if I were really savvy, here is the cool part where all the different icons would move around and do an exact move by move of all the different battles in the early parts of the War of the Five Kings, the early parts of the show. But frankly, I'm not that savvy. And so I'm just going to throw up here some of the battle names and their approximate locations, just so that you understand the point. One of the points of Risk, as a game is that you can't just fly across the map and attack wherever you want. Your attacks are limited to the territories from which you control to ones that are adjacent to you. And so we see early in the show, in the beginning of the Battle of the Five Kings, or excuse me, the War of the Five Kings, all of the battles really take place over this course of 4 or 5 territories, and it's very much based on things like, yeah, hey, things like rivers and mountains and terrain and fortifications and towns. All of these things are going to come into play, and you see all of the different move and counter move and all the different strategies that occur really right here in the heartland of uh, Westeros. And then, of course, all of this changes later on in the post-book seasons. Pretty much in the post-book seasons, wherever the army needs to be, they can attack. If they need to go all the way across the map, sure, why not? I mean, some of them make sense where it's like, well, those guys were kind of close, but then, it's kind of like, well, hey, screw logistics or screw terrain or, any of that kind of stuff. It's basically just a free-for-all, and wherever we need the armies to be, we can have them be, as some of the moves here in the south. Or, let's look at the north. And of course, not just the fact that Daenerys can get her dragons all the way from Dragonstone, 1,000 miles or more up until the wall within, I guess, a couple of hours. But things like when the Knights of the Vale come to relieve Jon Snow's forces at the Battle of the Bastards, they're apparently able to just, casually go through all of these territories. And I don't know, maybe they just were hanging out, or maybe they took over another one and just no one knew. But none of the distances or sort of territory rules seem to apply at all in the post-book season. Rule number 2, the ref decides who goes next rather than the players, taking turns in order the way a normal game is supposed to be played. So I need to talk about Balon Greyjoy for a minute in order to make this point home. So, of course, Balon Greyjoy can be summarized largely in the quote that he gave to his son, "No man gives me a crown, I pay the iron price, I will take my crown." And very much describes the Iron Men and the men of the islands very well. They're raiders, they're pirates, they're marauders, they're conquerors. They're all about capturing and taking. And so, of course, he understands that when Robb Stark takes his army south, this leaves him vulnerable. And so then, of course, they can commence with raiding and pillaging and doing what they do best in the north. And of course, in the books, he dies fairly early on. He actually dies before the Red Wedding. And with his death, it creates a power vacuum. And so while the Iron Men are still doing raiding and reaving and everything, nevertheless, there is this power vacuum between his 2 brothers, as well as his daughter, where they're trying to resolve. And so the sort of the hesitation or the sort of stagnation, I guess, perhaps, of the Iron Men, it kind of makes sense in that context. But he dies much later in the TV show. And so there's really no reason why. It just seems like he's not making any moves. He's just kind of sitting around like, and to me, again, it feels like the ref's like, well, you don't get to move until I tell you you can. And of course, in the show, they decided to simplify the plot by just having one brother, Euron, who's nothing like the character from the books, where he basically seizes control. And he does this largely on a promise like, hey, we're going to unite with Daenerys and we're going to conquer the 7 kingdoms and burn everything to the ground. And it's very much in keeping with that Iron Man ideology. But then when, Yara gets there first with Daenerys, he pretty much gives up on that immediately. And he doesn't really seem interested in raiding. Like, you'd think maybe he'd be like, hey, there's all these vulnerable territories and, hey, maybe we can conquer and get a foothold down here because there's been so much civil strife and infighting and everything like that. But honestly, he kind of just does like a 180 on his plan. like he basically decides like, okay, well, maybe I can't conquer Westeros. I'm just going to take my Iron Fleet all the way to King's Landing, and I'm going to just go ahead and marry Cersei. And, instead of all this, like, we're Iron Men, we take what we want and we're going to pay the iron price. Instead, I'm just going to marry into power, I guess. And it just kind of, again, seems very much like his actions are being dictated by the referee rather than something that makes sense naturally. Euron also gets to, have some extra moves, I guess. Like, because, Daenerys and her whole army and fleet and all this, they're at Dragonstone, and somehow Euron's able to get past them to King's Landing. And then, of course, they're still just kind of hanging out, doing nothing. And he's able to move again because, like, the ref gave him 2 free moves. So he's able, therefore, to ambush Yara's fleet and to capture Illyria Sand and her daughter. And again, I don't know exactly how he knew they were on there, but again, it's not like a natural feeling. It's just kind of like the ref almost sort of pushing him to make these moves. Rule number 3, players can abandon territory. All right, so now we got to talk about Stannis Baratheon and kind of some of what goes on with him to make this point home. Of course, we know Stannis attempted to take King's Landing and was rebuffed, ended up back at Dragonstone, and then Melisandre convinced him all the way to go up to the wall and, hey, prove you're the true king by going up there and repelling the invasion of the wildlings from coming across the wall. And then, of course, Stannis decides to try to seize control of the north by attacking the Boltons at Winterfell disastrously. However, and this is kind of one of those muddled areas, I feel like, that certainly that course of action is consistent with his actions in the book. However, the show doesn't develop it enough by basically talking about what happens down in the Stormlands. Of course, the Stormlands were originally loyal to Renly Baratheon, but then when Renly was killed, they switched their allegiance over to Stannis Baratheon. There's a quite significant portion of the book where it talks about, it was very important to him symbolically to hold Storm's End, their ancestral lands. So in theory, even after they lost at the Battle of Blackwater Bay and they moved north, they should still have had all of these 3 territories. But the show kind of just doesn't really even talk about them at all. I mean, it just seems like Stannis abandoned them all completely and took all of his forces northward. And it sort of begs the question, like, who's even in control of these lands down here? And a normal game of Risk, you're not allowed to abandon territories, but Stannis just basically gives it all up. And it just doesn't seem to make sense. Rule number 4, the ref declares certain players automatically must forfeit. We're getting to the point where the show committed what I consider to be the worst crime of all, and that was their treatment of Dorne. And I'm using it metaphorically to say that it was like the ref coming in and basically saying, I don't really like this player. I don't really like his strategy. I'm just going to basically find a way to force him to forfeit the game early on. You look at the character of Prince Duran, basically nothing about how this character is developed and introduced in the book translates onto film. The showrunners, apparently, they very much wanted to just focus on Illyria Sand, and so they were like, well, have her take out Prince Duran and take over Dorne, but nothing about the execution of that makes sense. And it felt very much like, hey, we just want this faction, we don't want to be involved with it, we don't want them to get involved, we don't want them to be a major player. So when you look at things, to me, what is really baffling is, of course, in the post-book seasons, we have the Iron Fleet under Euron. They're able to capture Illyria Sand after she's staged her coup in Dorne, and she's brought back to Cersei. And after that, we never hear really anything about Dorne, aside from perhaps 1 or 2 throwaway lines. But it sort of begs the question, and it's like, what's going on down in Dorne? Did all of Dorne just now become a neutral power? Like, did they just all give up and they're all, is there infighting? Is there civil strife? Or did they get involved in any way? But they all just seem to have stood out like, we're not even going to bother to mention what's going on or to introduce any other factions. And again, it feels very much based on a TV show mentality where it's, well, we're too late in the game, we can't introduce new people, or the audience won't understand. But it feels very like we were cheated, especially when you take a look and consider certain other actions. Like, for example, after Cersei became queen and destroyed the majority of House Tyrell, we see some of the other lords of the Reach. We see Randall Tarley, for example. He basically personifies, some of the major lords of the Reach. And there was a really good scene where Jaime Lannister convinces him to join sides with the Lannisters, where he explains, hey, you can either stay with Olenna Tyrell and join with a foreign queen who you know nothing about and will take your chances, or you can take your chances with us. So it made sense logically why you would show, certain lords of the Reach switching sides, switching their allegiance, but none of that played out in Dorne. It was just like the show was like, hey, we don't care about Dorne enough to really do any kind of development or anything. And it's just basically like, it was there, now it's gone. Let's not even worry about it. Let's move on. I'm going to rant some more about Dorne here because, again, I absolutely deplore what they did with it. But to step aside from the risk metaphor for a moment, one of the rules of the Game of Thrones is that it's a game of hostages. It really is. And if you look at so many of the characters who were hostages and how hostages plays out as a strategy of the Game of Thrones. Theon Greyjoy was a hostage of House Stark for many, many years, him growing up. You had Sansa, who spent half the entire show as a hostage. You had Ned Stark initially, when the war is just breaking out, he's a hostage, and then when he's killed, it's actually considered a major misstep on the half of the Lannisters that they killed him rather than using him. Jaime Lannister, he spent an entire season as a hostage. Bran and Rickon were captured and made hostages early on, and of course, when Theon pretends like he has killed them, it becomes a major point of, well, hey, you just totally threw away a major bargaining chip here. Brienne was briefly a hostage until they realized we can't do much with her, or we really don't care to do much with her. You have Robin Arryn was effectively a hostage from Littlefinger when he took over the Mountain and the Vale. And then, of course, Edmure Tully, there was a major plot point involved him being taken as a hostage, and then Jaime being able to manipulate him as a hostage. And a major theme is because there's such strong loyalty to these houses and to these bloodlines and to these characters that taking hostages is such an important part of the Game of Thrones. The show decided to go for shock value, though, with Dorne. And I guess they thought, well, hey, this really interesting and complex subplot in the books, nobody really cares that much, or it's too late, or something. I don't know. They basically decided, and of course I do know that they really enjoyed the actress who played Ilaria Sand, but nothing about how they did Dorne makes any sense given the prior rules of the game. Of course, basically Dorne's got only 2 members of House Martell that are introduced after Oberyn is killed, of course. We got Prince Doran, and we have his son Trystane. And then, of course, Ilaria is in this mad plot where she wants to murder Myrcella Baratheon, and is wanting to do that more than anything because somehow just killing all the Lannisters is the revenge that she really wants. But they could have maybe made this work. Like maybe if it would have been, hey, we want to kill Doran and Myrcella, but then we're going to hold Trystane as a hostage. We're going to rule in his name, or we're going to be kind of like a regent figure, which is not unheard of because they do a similar thing with Edmure Tully, where we kind of see that he's held hostage and they're able to, the Lannisters that is, to get what they want. And of course, with Robin Arryn, as already discussed. Very much, could have made sense in that context where it's like, hey, Duran dies, maybe he would have died under more mysterious circumstances, and Marcella's gone, and maybe they're able to manipulate Tristane in this kind of way. But they basically are just like, nope, we're just going to kill them all. And despite a huge foundation of this world that they've built being noble families and bloodlines and the smaller houses and the common people being beholden to the great houses, we're just going to throw that all out the window. All the people of Dorne hate the ruling family. There's no other strong factions. Everybody's perfectly willing to accept this commoner woman as now being ruler. And it's really sad when you think about how complex and interesting what they're building towards in the books. For example, in the books, the fact that Marcella is promised to Tristane is going to be a major issue because the laws are different in Dorne. In all the rest of Westeros, that's a difficult thing to say, in all the other seven kingdoms, the rules of inheritance are basically the oldest male wins. Whoever the oldest male is, he inherits, and the only way women inherit is if there are no other males. But it's different in Dorne. Dorne, the oldest child inherits. Women are allowed to inherit the same as men. And this is a very important point because Marcella was the older of the two siblings after Joffrey. So after Joffrey died, of course, Tommen is made king based on the law and the rest of the seven kingdoms. But Marcella, according to the law of Dorne, should have been the ruler. So we kind of see that this plan of Tyrion's is kind of backfiring. Like, oh crap, I didn't see that coming. And so again, it's very intricate, very exciting, a very compelling storytelling. They just threw it all out the window and basically decided, yeah, we're going to make Ilaria Sand be this crazy person who just basically kills everybody and seizes control. But it basically means that I would have given her the worst player award for just not understanding the rules of the game at all. But part of the whole video here is they're changing the rules. And again, I guess it's like they're changing the rules because they're like, hey, we need to speed things up. We've got a stopping point. Let's just go ahead and kind of take out some of these other characters and streamline things because, this game's got to end. We can't just wait to see how it plays out. We basically know how we want it to play out. So let's just kind of get them there. And finally, we come to rule number 5. Certain players can re-roll, which basically what I'm referring to here is plot armor. No one is safe. That was one of the early drawing appeals to the show was this idea that pretty much any character could go. But the characters, when they died, it had nothing to do with they're good players or they're good people or bad people or they're good, evil, wicked, virtuous. It all really had to do with how well they played the game. With some exceptions, there were characters that just had a stroke of bad luck, but luck is a component of gameplay. Some of them, were betrayed and didn't quite judge their family as well as they judged their enemies. But nevertheless, it was very much the people who win were good at the game. The people who lost were bad at the game. That rule changed because of plot armor. Let's take a look at one of my favorite characters, and that is Jaime Lannister. Brilliant character, one of the best characters, I think, in all the fiction initially, because we see how much he changed. Completely awful person, and of course I'm not going to get into all the ins and outs of that, but what defined Jaime as a person beyond his affair with his sister was his prowess in battle. He was one of the best knights in all the seven kingdoms. He was virtually unstoppable, and everybody knew that. And then he loses his hand. And oh my gosh, now he can't be a warrior anymore. And it really sort of forces him to actually, for the first time in his life, grow as a human being. And of course, they get into much better details in the books where we see how much Cersei manipulated him his entire life. But bottom line is that he grows, he changes, and he struggles because he now is no longer a great warrior. In fact, we see him struggle even on the show where he's trying to awkwardly learn how to fight again with his left hand. And we know he's never going to be the great warrior that he once was. And yet somehow, I'm not sure how, but when the Night King finally, comes down and it's the big epic battle of ice and fire, there's Jamie holding his own, you know, left-handed. He's somehow just as good as Brienne and all the other great warriors. Because, again, instead of things happening naturally and having that cause and effect, it's nope, plot armor, because we want to have a setup and payoff kind of model instead. The game of Risk has been around a long time, and as far as I know, continues to be a very popular game. And I know a big criticism is the dice aspect to the battles. A lot of people feel that the dice aspect creates too much of a randomness, too much of a luck-based element. But I think in the terms of a battle, luck can be a huge deciding factor. Sometimes things don't go the way we expect. In fact, one of the principles of combat that they teach in the Army is that the best battle plans rarely survive the first contact with the enemy. So I think the dice are a good metaphor for that and just how things can go. And likewise, I think that element of randomness inserted into a larger game of strategy, like in the Game of Thrones, is what makes it so appealing and is what made it so interesting. And of course, unfortunately, what I feel like in the later seasons is instead of dice, you have this ref basically inserting himself and basically saying, oh, okay, this is going this way. And well, we didn't really like how that dice roll went, so you can kind of go ahead and re-roll. And unfortunately, it did have an impact. And I feel like that is why a lot of people kind of started to turn on the show in the later seasons, or perhaps not turn on it, but at least felt like something had been lost between the original and what came later. So there you have it. I encourage you all to go out and find the Game of Risk, either the Game of Thrones edition or the Classic edition. Play with one another. Don't quite be as cutthroat as, say, like people on the show were, because you probably want to still, have those friends and family afterwards. But feel free to comment and let me know what you feel about this review. I understand it was kind of a tortured metaphor, but it was basically my thoughts on, hey, this is where we were and that's where we went. So I'm very grateful to the fact that they've made a version of Risk for me to rip off and use in this review. So take care and see you later.